I'm John Law, this is Chasing Cars, and today we're looking at the latest installment of the Warrior saga by Nissan and Premcar. To give it its full name, the car behind me is the 2022 Nissan Navara PRO-4X Warrior by Premcar. So what does that mean? It means it's effectively the toughest Navara you can get, and it's Australian developed, just like the original NTREC Warrior you came along with me to test a couple of years ago. Now, unfortunately, that car's life was a little bit abbreviated coming in the latter part of that D23 Navara's life. But now we've got a facelift which launched about a year ago, and Premcar has worked their magic once again. So what's the recipe behind the Navara PRO-4X Warrior? Well, that's what I'm going to talk to you about today. But effectively, the good things about the new Warrior is that Premcar had a stronger base to work off with the updated Navara, and they've done pretty much the same thing they did before, which is to broaden the bandwidth of the car and also make it really fun to drive off-road. We'll get to all that in a minute, because first we're going to dive into the design, the cabin, and the practicality of this thing before we take it on-road and off-road to test the mettle of the new Navara. One of the most important things is getting customers into the dealership, and I think the PRO-4X Warrior has done a pretty good job of enticing people to come in. I mean, look at it, it looks mad, it's super tough. The changes they've made with the fender flares, the extra red cladding underneath, and the black 17-inch alloy wheels. I mean, you can let me know in the comment section down below what you think, but personally, I think the best way to sum it up is here, this sort of hoopless bull bar setup we've got. It's really quite intricately folded steel, made here in Australia, and there's a little story to go behind it, because the owners of the previous NTREC Warrior found that their bull bars were getting a little bit too easily stone chipped. So what did Premcar do? They redeveloped the paint system. So underneath what you can see here, it's actually powder coated. And the idea behind that is that when it gets stone chips, inevitably, then you can't see through to the bare metal, which I reckon is really rad. There's a couple of other rad things. The LED light bar integration sets off beautifully the new LED headlights, and of course, you can fit a winch to it. You can get one from a Nissan dealership straight out of the box if you want, but you don't have to have it, and that's something that Premcar has done to address criticisms of some of the buyers. So, around the back of the Nissan Navara, and this is something that Nissan addressed Australian customer feedback on for the 2021 update that you can see here, that gets these nice rear tail lights and black badge with red writing from the PRO-4X. What they addressed is extra payload, because the Navara's coil-sprung rear end meant that it was a little bit limited before, but now pretty much every model in the Navara range can take over 1,000 kilograms worth of payload, except for this car, which drops by only about 50 kilos compared to the regular PRO-4X to 950 kilos. Now that may sound like a bit of a compromise, but compared to the original NTREC Warrior, it's got 200 extra kilos of capacity, and that means it's more usable every day for people who need to carry stuff in the tray, and that's a big thing for PRO-4X Warrior customers. We drop down that tailgate, and we've got a plastic bed liner in here as well. It's quite nicely finished, 4 tie-down points, and this modular racking system that you can attach accessories to from Nissan themselves. I'll flash the dimensions of the tray up over the screen, but it's a ute tray, and it does the job, and now it's got more payload, so that's pretty much all we need to know. Let's talk about the running costs of this Nissan Navara Warrior. So jumping into the front seat of the Nissan Navara PRO-4X Warrior, and it feels very much like the Nissan Navara PRO-4X, because apart from the Warrior stitching in the headrests, it's pretty much identical. That means you get the same size touchscreen here, which is relatively responsive, and you can get wired Apple CarPlay and Android Auto. You've got navigation as standard as well, and also DAB radio, so it's all pretty decent for this sort of segment, not class leading, but also not particularly falling behind. You do have some cool features like your off-roading camera that's been added for the PRO-4X, so you can see the position of the front wheels that hopefully we'll get to use in a little while. But yeah, works well. Physical dials for volume and scrolling on the navigation and also for radio, so that's great. below that, simple analog climate controls there, so you can just adjust your temperature right on the fly. And then of course we've got all the 4x4 stuff, the selector for 2 high, 4 high and 4 low, diff lock, hill descent control, and then you've got also this little 12-volt socket. But we'll come back to all that when we go off-roading, because this segment is about the interior, which isn't the most wow factor piece of this Navara Pro-4X Warrior for sure. All this scratchy plastic up here on the dashboard, certainly a workmanlike vehicle, scratchy on the doors as well, but you know, easy to clean, easy to get the mud off in this case, because it is a rather wet couple of days we've spent up here driving this car. But yeah, there are some nice touches. You've got the updated steering wheel here, nice attractive central bezel here with the airbag cover. It's very nice, leather appointed, and it feels about the right size. It's a little bit bigger than the old Navara's wheel, which I personally really like. It allows you to get a little bit more leverage on it, and that's great for doing off-roading and tight corners and all that sort of stuff. Ahead of the steering wheel, we've also got these pretty well presented analog dials that are easy to read and simple to use. Now let's talk a little bit about the seats, because although they're quite well presented with this sort of leather quilting here, you got your Pro-4X and, as I mentioned before, your Warrior emblazoning, they are not the most comfortable seats in the world. They are quite flat, and as an odd spec choice, the Pro-4X standard car and this Warrior don't actually get heated seats. Now in the N-Trek, that was the case, that you had heated seats, and in the more affordable Navara STX you also have heated seats now. So I think it's a bit odd to omit the heated seats, but apparently it's to do with where these seats are made and the sourcing, that means just doesn't interface too well. Also, while the driver gets decent manual adjustment, the passenger only gets fore and aft and backrest, no height adjustment, which isn't too much of an issue because the seats are set fairly low, so if you're sort of my height, it's not too bad to sit in the passenger seat. Now, of course, one of the things you need in a work truck is a bit of practicality. You've got to carry around your invoices, carry around your pens, work on the move with a laptop, and that sort of thing. And I think that's where the slightly old-feeling Navara's cabin kind of lets you down a little bit, because there's not that much in terms of space to store things or clever little bits of pocket storage. So for example, we've got a USB charger here and a little sort of hard tray that's just about big enough to fit your phone in, but if you want to have it charging, you have to have it a bit of a weird angle. But we do have 2 good cup holders in the middle here, and a nice door bin in the pocket as well. And then under this leatherish appointed central armrest, we've got a decent little storage bin, USB-C charger, USB-A charger, and a 12-volt socket, and enough space to store like Mentos or even a bit of sunscreen. That's pretty good. The only real issue I have is the size of the glove box, because there's not a double glove box like you get in the Toyota HiLux, and when you do pop this thing, it's not that spacious in terms of fitting anything like a book or major items in there. You can't really close it after you've done that. So I think that's definitely something worth addressing for the next generation of Navara, but obviously it's totally outside the scope of what Premcar's done with the Warrior, and what really matters is the suspension. So in the back seat of the Pro-4X Warrior, obviously it's not the most exciting part of this car, but Nissan has worked quite hard since the previous Navara, evidently, to make the back seat a more comfortable place to be. At 6'2", I have relatively good room behind my driving position. My knees are just about brushing against the seat, but you know, if you're shorter than me, you're going to be really comfortable. I also have relatively decent toe room, especially for a dual cab, that's balanced with decent headroom and a bit of a stadium seating vibe, so I can see out over the top of the headrest. So I'm actually quite comfortable. The width isn't, I mean, it's not the widest dual cab on the market, but you could probably just about squeeze someone into the middle seat. Again, it is a bit of a perch, but you know, comes with the territory. You've also got a pretty flat floor, and importantly, we've got air vents back here for hot Australian days. You've also got a USB charger to keep your thing charged. So presumably, if you're going to use this as a family vehicle, it's actually not as compromised as dual cabs used to be. And I think that's a pretty good thing. So let's start with fuel economy. Nissan claims a combined fuel consumption of 8.1 litres per 100 kilometres for the Pro-4X Warrior with its 2.3 litre turbo diesel. Now, yesterday's drive was 160 Ks, but it's not exactly indicative of what you're going to see in the real world, though we returned 10.9 litres per 100 Ks with a fair bit of slow crawling and a little bit of highway driving, which I reckon isn't bad at all for a vehicle like this. So for insurance, over the last 12 months, the median budget direct customer paid $1,120 to comprehensively insure their new Nissan Navara. Now, everyone's situation is different, and your premium will vary based on things that insurers take into account, such as where you live, whether you garage the car, and your driving history. Now for servicing, Nissan offers cap price servicing package for the Nissan Navara PRO-4X Warrior, which is one of the beautiful things about it being backed by an OEM. The cap price servicing runs for 5 years and has a $2,589 total cost, and the intervals are pretty long for this segment at 12 months or 20,000 Ks. So, what is the Nissan Navara PRO-4X Warrior like to drive out on the road in these rather miserable conditions just outside of Coffs Harbour? Well, I'm happy to report that even in these testing times, this wet roads, yesterday we had muddy, claggy off-road stuff, the Navara PRO-4X Warrior is doing a bang-up job. And honestly, this kind of condition usually shows up dual cabs really badly, especially in the wet on the road, bumpy roads like this. They can feel skittish and skippy. But luckily, the tuning done by the team at Premcar in Australia has done a bang-up job of not only making this car better off-road, but also broadening its capability on-road. And that's the whole deal of the Warrior program. But before we get to that, I'm going to talk you through all of the Nissan components of this car, starting with the drivetrain. Now, this is one of the things that the Navara is sort of starting to feel a bit old hat in now. I mean, you've watched the new reveal of the Ranger. I'm not sure if Tom's reviewed one yet, but a V6 engine in that sort of ute. It's got a lot of grunt, and this 2.3 litre twin turbo 4-cylinder diesel engine only makes 140 kilowatts and 450 newton meters. Now that used to be pretty much on par with the Toyota HiLux, but obviously that car's gone and been updated with a bit of extra grunt, so that's now up to 150 and 500. So this is better than the Triton, the Mitsubishi Triton, but it's still not the most powerful ute, at least on paper. And Premcar is still reluctant to do anything to the engine on account of, I guess, affecting warranty basically. This car is going to be pretty bulletproof. That's sort of the beauty of leaving an engine stock, and you start fiddling around with that sort of stuff and you start having to spend a whole lot more time homologating things. So that's why Premcar's kind of left the engine well alone. As for the transmission, I'm driving the automatic at the moment. You can get a 6-speed manual as well for $2,500 less, which makes this car fairly affordable, but it's likely that most people are going to go for this 7-speed torque converter automatic gearbox, and it's been improved since the last car. Certainly it works quite well out here on the road, but as you'll see when we get to a bit of off-road driving, there are a couple of quirks to it that mean it can be slightly annoying, but it's definitely better tuned than the last gearbox. It holds gears and seems to work. The power and torque that this engine has pretty decently, but again, it's certainly not absolute best in class for powertrain. But that's not what the Warrior is all about, because the Warrior is all about the suspension tuning, and that's what we're going to talk about now. Firstly, about the on-road characteristics, and then we're going to dive into a bit of off-roading. So let's talk about the suspension, because that really is the most important thing about this Navara Warrior from my perspective, because Premcar has worked plenty of magic to make this thing not only better off-road, they haven't sacrificed any of its on-road manners, and in fact, they've made it better. It tips in better than a normal Navara, has more control, and why is that? Well, it's because they've fiddled with the dampers and the spring rates, softening things, stiffening other aspects to create a car that is more poised and more in control more of the time to suit the Australian preferences. So what have they done? Well, they've effectively softened the spring rates front and rear over the normal Pro-4X. However, the rear spring gets a stiffer secondary part to its travel, which means that this car can have more payload than the old Navara Warrior. And I've already covered that around the back of this thing, and that's great because that means this is almost at the payload that you can get in the regular Pro-4X. It's only about 52 kilos down. So considering you've got all this extra off-road stuff, that's great. And it's also supposed to help in towing, and of course, when you've got big payloads in the back, it should assist in that, but we've only driven the Navara Warrior unladen, so can't really comment on that. But the composure and poise of this car is something that is really impressive, certainly for a dual cab. You've got this really plush sort of top of the travel in the damper, so it feels like it's got a really low breakaway force that allows them to just sort of subtly move around while you're driving down the road, and it keeps your head much flatter than in the regular Pro-4X. And yeah, they've just done a bang-up job. They've even managed to make it feel like it tips in almost like a large SUV. It's still definitely a dual cab, but yeah, you can hustle this thing down the road and on fast dirt, and it works well. Let's talk about safety as well, because
that is one of the sore points of this Navara. You can feel like it's getting on in years, and that's pretty much because it's sort of an evolution of an evolution of an evolution. And although this new car looks amazing, the Pro-4X actually misses a couple of things. So you've got forward collision warning and AEB for pedestrian and cars, but this car doesn't have adaptive cruise control, which may be annoying for you. Personally, I actually really like that because it means I can drive along on the freeway at the speed I select. It feels a bit more old school, but I know a lot of people really do love adaptive cruise control systems, and if you want all that, then something like the Isuzu D-Max has plenty of features to keep you happy, but without perhaps the off-road capability and comfort on-road that this thing has, because it is spectacular. It does have a lane keep assist system as well, the Pro-4X Warrior, but yeah, like most dual cabs, the implementation of these things aren't quite as bang up to job as you get on a large SUV. So that's pretty much the normal road driving stuff out of the way for the Navara Pro-4X Warrior, and to sum it up, it's better in pretty much every aspect. But now we get to play with these toggles down here. We've got 3 modes, 2-wheel drive, and you can switch to 4-wheel drive high on the fly, and you pop it into neutral, stop, and swap it into 4-wheel drive low, and you get to have some real fun, and that's what we're going to jump to right now. So after a little bit of talking about the road driving and the greater breadth of ability that Premcar has bestowed on the Navara Pro-4X, what's it like off-road on this glum old day just outside of Coffs Harbour on the Australian launch? We're driving it through these forest roads and on some technical trails, and I've got to say it's doing an astounding job, and a lot of praise has to go to Premcar and what they've managed to do with this vehicle, because although the standard Navara is a decent enough ute, this thing really does take it to the next level with some excellent chassis tweaks in the suspension, and of course the fitting of these larger tyres as well just makes this package really holistically a performance off-roader. It's great, it's a really fun car, and it makes off-roading accessible from the dealership. Of course, I already mentioned you're backed by that 5-year unlimited kilometre warranty as well, with all these parts installed. Even if you go for that winch, it's all covered. So I mean, what's not to love, really? But let's talk a little bit more about technical off-roading, because we're driving on a slightly more open flowing section of forest road here, and that's great, and it's soaking up the bumps really nicely, rounding off the sharp edges of the corrugations pretty well. Of course, you still get some of that body on frame sort of wiggle and shimmy over repeated bumps, but it does suppress it better than a lot of other vehicles in this class, and I think that's, again, a lot to do with the magic worked by Premcar, stiffening certain aspects of the suspension, softening others. It's got a much stricter rebound control than the regular Navara. It just makes you feel confident out here. And it makes you feel confident as well on technical stuff. Now, we just drove down a section called the Widowmaker, which was pretty gnarly, I've got to say. Had quite deep ruts on either side where the wheel tracks would fall into. Had quite deep ruts either side of the tracks for your wheels to fall into, soft mud, and the extra 40mm ground clearance in the Pro-4X Warrior really did help us to not bottom out at all, not need any of the extra underbody protection stuck under there. That 40mm lift, I should mention, is given through 15mm of extra spring height and also 25mm courtesy of the larger wheel and tyre package, which comprises a set of Cooper 83 Discoverer all-terrain tyres. They're 275, 70 and 17 on 17-inch rims, and yeah, they offer really good grip. We're in slightly muddy conditions, not super sloppy, gross mud, but definitely clayey and claggy, and they're performing very admirably. And really, that's the sum up of this car off the road. It performs so admirably. All the things that Premcar have touched are glorious. They're pretty as close to perfection. It's not quite as single-minded as the Ford Ranger Raptor. However, it does have a probably better daily use capability. It's narrower, and it's also a fair bit more affordable than that Ultra Ute. I guess you'd call it sort of some kind of hyper Ute maybe, whereas this feels a little bit more like a super Ute targeted at the HiLux Rugged X. But yeah, look, basically the Premcar update of this Nissan Navara Warrior is fantastic. And yeah, definitely something you should put on the shortlist for your next dual cab purchase, because it makes off-roading easy and it doesn't hurt its on-roading capability one bit. So what do we think of the Nissan Navara Pro-4X Warrior by Premcar? Well, much like the original N-Trek Warrior, the magic that Premcar has worked with the suspension, the tyre package, and how it looks is fantastic. And the recipe's been refined even further with even more comfort and control than the original.
What are our complaints? Well, we'd love to see a little bit more power added and gotten out of this 2.3 litre turbo diesel engine. We'd also love to see a bit of a cabin redesign, but of course that's outside the scope of this Pro-4X Warrior. And for what it is, for what it offers, and where it can take you, I reckon it's really rad. But of course, you can let me know in the comment section down below what you think, whether you consider the Pro-4X Warrior over its competitors. And while you're down there, we'd also love it if you could hit subscribe. And as always, thank you for watching Chasing Cars.